We need to understand the reality of construction, and we need to understand that compression is a thing, right? The challenge with compression and pushing things off because they have float, and then shortening durations when there's delays to get the schedule back on track, is that there's an over optimism bias that exists in construction.
Let's say one program, the VP comes back and is like, hey, Michael, all our projects are different. So how do we handle compression on these? We're building universities, we're building data centers, all this other stuff. And then one program is a predictable program. It's the same kind of building over and over again. Walk me through in both of those examples how you'd work with that VP to come up with kind of a game plan to tackle schedule compression.
Missing logic, to me, I define it as an activity does not have a predecessor or a successor. If an activity doesn't have both a predecessor and a successor, and it's not the first activity or the last activity, we have a problem. Everything should be driven by something, and everything should drive something else, even if it's the last milestone of the job. So we look at, how much logic is in this schedule.
Hi, folks. A quick one before we dive into this week's episode. Our book, The Critical Path Career, How to Advance in Construction and Planning and Scheduling, is out now, and you can order it on Amazon. We'll include a link below. This is a great way to show support for the Beyond Deadlines podcast, and Greg and I have worked extremely hard taking everything we know in our 30 years of experience, plus everything we've picked up from shooting this podcast, and we've tried to pack it into an information-dense book that you can use right away. In the book, we have specific strategies on how to get a raise, how to get a promotion, and find a new job. We include 26 of the best interview questions that we have come across, in addition to 34 specific impact ideas that you can go use on your projects today. We want to thank everyone who's shown us support so far, and enjoy this week's episode. Welcome to the Beyond Deadlines podcast, where we tackle challenges that planning and schedule leaders come across on a day-to-day basis. My name is Micah, and I'm the CEO of Movar US, a project management consultancy.
And my name is Michael Pink, and I'm the CEO of Smart PM Technologies, a data analytics solution to support project controls and construction.
Today, Michael's on the hot seat, and we are talking about schedule compression. This is going to be a good one because we are going to dive deep into this topic. So, Michael, you're working with a large GC, and at the end of each of their projects, everything seems to be moving perfectly smoothly, and then they get right about to the end and pop, the project blows out and it's late. A VP has noticed that this is a consistent trend that you're seeing. How do you address the issue?
First thing we need to do is we need to understand the reality of construction, and we need to understand that compression is a thing, right? Compression is a ever happening thing because the resource challenges that exist. The challenge with compression and pushing things off because they have float, and then shortening durations when there's delays to get the schedule back on track, is that there's an over optimism bias that exists in construction that would tend to push the PMs and supers with their level of optimism, because that's a natural thing that they're very good at, is being optimistic in a difficult world. But sometimes they make decisions without truly understanding what all that data means for the feasibility. And that is a gauge that you can look at through compression. So what I would be telling the VP is, let's start to study compression across your jobs and looking at, as it's mounting, what levels is it mounting to, and when, what sort of patterns do we see across your portfolio? And then we can then drill into how to solve that problem.
Now, let's say I'm the VP in this scenario, and I'm saying, Michael, that's great, but I've only heard of compression socks. So what is schedule compression?
So schedule compression is when you start to, you have a game plan when you create your baseline. You have listed all the activities, you've put in all the sequencing that you think makes sense, and then you start to progress your job, and not everything goes as planned, right? There's so many different things that need to happen if you wanted to keep up with your schedule. And then the value of these CPM engines that we look at as a management tool is that they have a value called float. And when something has float, that means it can be delayed without delaying the job. But the more you do, the more you push things off, the more things stack up. And that starts to create an environment where you're trying to do a lot more in a shorter amount of time. And that is what we define in construction scheduling as a compression. You're compressing your activities, you're stacking your trades, you're shortening your durations to still achieve the same goal. The level of compression that we need to look at is whether or not it's feasible with the resources that we have access to. And quite frankly, sometimes that compression gets so high that it's not possible. And nobody really understands that until they can visually look at the building and no, there's no way we're getting this thing done in 3 months, which is why we see this happening towards the end of the job, because our brains can't tell us that when the structure's going up with concrete, but it can tell us that when we're looking at all the trades buzzing around the building with about 2 months left to go before the deadline. And we don't think it's going to happen because we can now do the math in our head.
I love the oh no site walk where you finally are like, this is not going to work out. Okay, so we've got the definition of compression, and you brought up float, which float can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, unfortunately, and there are mathematical definitions for it. Let's say for this VP, I'm just kind of walking through what is brain power. Be like, okay, you said that activities are coming in. Well, then why don't we have enough float to handle this?
Well, my expert opinion is you have the float that you have based on how you structured your job with logic and activities. You can't really create float unless you actually have an acceleration plan that's been thought out and is possible and agreed to by the various parties. You can come up with ways to create float, but you need to have a plan around it in order to make it happen. For instance, if you decide to remove some logic to stack some trades, you need to get more resources there to do the work simultaneously. So creating float has to come with an action plan that makes sense. That is why one of the things that I've seen in the industry is people want to create float, but they don't want to do what it takes to make it happen. And that's where compression can be a silent killer on your job and end up in that situation where everybody's scrambling and now everybody's coming up with excuses and arguing as to why did this happen, and nobody's been looking at delays the whole time.
Let's look at this from like two different types of programs because I want to see if they're two different answers. Let's say one program, the VP comes back and is like, hey, Michael, all our projects are different. They're different projects. So how do we handle compression on these? We're building universities, we're building data centers, all this other stuff. And then one program is a predictable program. It's repeatable. It's the same kind of building over and over again. So walk me through in both of those examples, how you'd work with that VP to come up with kind of a game plan to tackle schedule compression.
Well, I'll start with the latter. In ways of looking at something that's repeatable, let's just say it's an office building or a multifamily building, and you build the same thing all over a city or all over a region. What you're going to be able to see is the pattern of performance and how that leads to ultimately what drives success or failure. And that's where I'd be looking at the trades. I'd be looking at how did you structure this stuff? Is it consistent? And then as we performed month over month, what seemed to be the trades that had the biggest impact on progress and performance? And look at it, all side by side.
Let's dive into that. Would you say project performance? So what's your preferred method there? Are you looking at activity start and finishes on time? Are you looking at resources? Like what would be your kind of ideal when you say performance? How would you measure that?
Well, I'd be looking at the activities in the schedule. So I'd be looking at, hey, we had a plan, we progressed that plan. There's two things that can affect compression. Number one is pushing things off that have float to a later date. And that's usually because you don't have enough resources to do the work. When you create a schedule, you get these early starts and your early finishes. And when you have float, really the definition of that is saying total float is if it's greater than zero, then you have a certain number of days that activity can be delayed without impacting the end date of the job. So naturally, if there's not enough resources, you would want to put the resources on the critical and near critical activities with the least amount of float, and any additional resources you start to put on the other activities that you had access to. So I'd be looking at what's delaying my job and how are we responding to those delays through changes, and how compressed are we getting, and time again, what trades are typically driving the critical and near critical path throughout. So basically, you would want to be looking at your as-built critical path and the storyline behind those things, like what drove the job, what delayed the job, how did they respond to those things, what continued to delay the job, and try to get some patterns of what would be my critical and near critical trades across a collective group of projects that are very similar. And then that's where you'd start to think about, now that I've got this data, I know what trades, come hell or high water, we absolutely need to stay on top of to get these things done on time. And I also know some of the patterns that exist in their response to impacts, and whether or not they're continuing to, one, compress the job, which is essentially an acceleration effort, and whether or not they're actually putting the controls in place to effectively deliver on those changes.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense, and it took my second question out of my bag for me, where I was, well, what do you do about it next? So let's talk about something that makes sense to me on a repeatable program. Let's go back to that other one where it's a different, there's always that my project is unique. No offense to people who feel their projects are unique. Although I'm kind of the opinion now where I'm like, man, you got concrete, you got steel, you got wire. It's all kind of the same stuff in a little different formation. I'm sure people with the pitchforks will come after me on that one. But now you have a different project each time. How do you start to leverage compression there to start seeing angles in your schedule where you can help improve and do sorts of things?
I think that when projects are different, so we've got a lot of customers that do, many different types of projects. Sometimes you can bucket similar projects into similar categories. You can drill it up to a higher level, like an industrial project versus a vertical project versus a horizontal project. So there are certain consistencies to your point. I mean, yeah, an industrial facility is different than a Chick-fil-A, but there is still the order of operations. Is you're going to dig a hole, you're going to put some concrete in, then you're going to put some structure in, and then you're going to start to put the guts in, and then you're going to start to close it up and test it. But being that projects are different and managers are different and schedulers are different, I would be keying in on the behavioral patterns to understand what behavioral patterns are promoting risk here from the manager or the scheduler. And those behavioral patterns could be a number of things. It can be starting with, do they know how to build a high quality schedule at the get-go that follows best practices? There's about 35 different metrics you can look at to determine whether or not the scheduler is setting this schedule up for success from a structural perspective. And then there's the behavioral pattern in the updates, right? It doesn't matter if you're putting in concrete or steel. If they're not focused on the critical and near critical paths, and things are getting delayed for whatever reason, and their response is to right the ship, and then in turn build in a acceleration plan, and then they're not hitting their activities and they're not staying focused on the critical and near critical paths, or they continue to get into this cycle of the job gets delayed and then the response is to compress. Understanding those updating practices, understanding the schedule practices, being able to gauge, are they focused in the right areas? Do they understand the value of criticality, near criticality? Are they still trying to progress other areas? Are they doing what it takes to keep up with plan? You can start to see those behavioral patterns from the manager, even on different types of jobs. And then we'll look at that on a single job. Our program will show you that on a single job, or show you a macro level of your organization and start to detect some of the consistent patterns in the people in your organization of how they're actually managing with the data that they have access and the tools that they're using. And then those patterns start to become the areas where you want to focus on educating them of the risks that happen so that they start to understand this process of scheduling and what sort of responsibilities are necessary from their perspective to support the business and themselves for success. So that's the two different ways that I would be able to look at it, or I would look at it if I were him.
Lots to dive into and unpack there. But since this is a planning and scheduling show, I have to ask, you mentioned 35 checks, and I think I have a good idea of at least 14 of them. But you're put out on a desert island. I say, Michael, you can only pick three things. You open up a schedule, three things that you're going to check out. Let's say, I don't want to say schedule quality. I want to say like the validity of the plan, which could mean schedule quality, but like, you know what I mean? Like you're like, hey, this project said to finish at this date. I've given you a schedule. You can pick 3 things to look at. What 3 things do you pick? And you can't cheat and say I'm going to put it into Smart PM. That's not fair. All right, so you gotta pick.
Well, having looked at a lot of them, and we meet clients at different places, and those customers that we meet, we have to determine where are they at in their project controls journey. And a lot of times, when you get into the smaller construction organizations, we want to get them fixing schedule quality, and I like to start with missing logic, number one. Like
So
I
stuff
am a
like when you say missing logic, you mean stuff not tied together or stuff that just has low amounts of logic?
Well, there's two. Missing logic to me, I define it as an activity does not have a predecessor or a successor. If an activity doesn't have both a predecessor and a successor, and it's not the first activity or the last activity, we have a problem. Everything should be driven by something, and everything should drive something else, even if it's the last milestone of the job. So we look at, how much logic is in this schedule. The next area I would look at is how much high float do you have? Because missing logic, once that problem is solved, the next question is, are you still missing crew logic? Right? What happens when people build a schedule, sometimes they'll let's just think of like a 10-story building. They'll let that concrete or structural activities create that staggered flow. But when they get into the internal trades, they're not saying that we have a resource constraint. They're saying if things get delayed and we stack, well, there's unlimited resources to manage the stacking of those trades. And we want to put logic in there to keep those trades, sort of set up for having that crew constraint. And if that's missing, you're setting your schedule up for compression by design without necessarily understanding, the resource issues that are going to mount. And the other piece that happens is the true critical path starts to hide itself. And that would be the second thing. And I believe there's a number of other ones. We actually have two ways of looking at high float. There's an average float, but there's also a relationship of logic to activities. So I want to see generally a 2-to-1. I want to see twice as much logical ties than I do activities in the schedule. And that's because I want to know in a given area what trade is coming next, and then also where is that crew going next for the trade that we're talking about. So that's like a 2-to-1. The last one, I would say, I think long durations is something that I would look at too, separate from procurement activities, but long durations on actual activities. And the risk that exists there is that it's much more difficult on a longer duration to truly gauge progress unless you have a control in place to do that. So that makes it so you may be wrong about percent complete, and that could be starting to erroneously change the true critical path of the job and the near critical path and those things if you're estimating in your head wrong. And
Or
that's those
maybe
three.
you're using duration percent complete.
Right, exactly. So those are the things that I would say if I'm looking at a
Disclaimer,
schedule.
folks. Disclaimer, folks. You probably don't want to use duration percent complete. I better say that before someone runs
Yeah.
off.
So yeah, those are the areas that if I'm walking into an organization that really needs to put the best controls in place to create schedules that I think will mostly have accurate float values and critical paths and near critical paths, those would be the top three for me.
Those are amazing, and I love the. I've heard it quite before, but the logic, the activity, the logic is consistently overmissed because you get into some of the, at least my experience, mostly on larger jobs. You get into those larger jobs, and I think people almost just get a little bit of schedule fatigue when you just start kind of going to single relationships or just kind of just like, yeah, and it falls apart. Jumping back into our hypothetical now, the VP wants to get proactive now. It's like, Mike, you've done a great job laying out this case. You've done an amazing job explaining compression. How do I get proactive about this now? How do I start using this as a proactive measure KPI instead of reactive? He's like, you've laid it out and it feels reactive, but now I want to move to proactive. Can you walk us through a little bit how that compression can really get to be a proactive tool?
Yeah, absolutely. So monitoring it, right? The way in which we monitor it in Smart PM is we basically look at what was your earned value curve over time. And then you track planned progress versus actual progress. And then you look at, what's going on with the delays, right? Or what, if you're not keeping up with planned progress, but you're not delayed, that means that you're actually keeping up with the critical path, but you're pushing a lot of things off towards the end. But if you are also being delayed and you're riding the ship through changes, you're doing a little bit of double compression, which will just increase the curve. But I like to use compression as a means to making sure that when it gets to a certain threshold above, we'll call it 10, 20, 10 or 15%, that the project manager is proactively, looking at the plan and making sure that the resources are where they need to be to progress in accordance with the plan. And then another metric that you can gauge as well as historical performance as an indicator of future performance or predictive. So between those two, you can see where's the project headed based on historical performance, and then how compressed are we? And those are the two things that if you start to be proactive with keeping up, that those numbers start to decrease. So what we use is that those numbers to have that difficult discussion with the PM that we're not on track, and it's because we're delayed for certain reasons. It's because certain things are getting pushed off. The response has been to compress, which I agree with, but now we need to deliver. And one other area that we look at side by side with compression through our tool is should have started, should have finished activities based on your compressed schedule. What percentage are you starting on time? What percentage are you starting late? And what percentage are you not starting at all? And looking at it side by side with the finishes. So now you have everything in all the data you need to not be told that everything's going to be fine. And I think that that's the point that you want to get to with a PM or a super is that, I get it. We've had delays. I get it. Construction's hard. I get it. We respond by, making it harder. And we deliver. You're good at what you do, but the data is telling me that while you're compressing, we're not actually delivering. So now we need to deliver. And that's where we see the reaction. The reaction is no longer, this isn't my opinion versus yours. This data is telling us everything we need to know. And now I've got to go put that action plan into execution. And what happens at that point is you start to see those numbers go down, and you start to see that predictive end date line up after a couple months, which then they feel that sense of accomplishment. That's how we generally use those metrics with our customers to get the teams to rally around what the data is saying, and then they actually get something out of it. They feel successful. They are successful. They've righted the ship. They don't have that nasty feeling at the end of the job.
Yeah, I've always used when I don't have fancy tools available, I like to use just the simple manager math. When I just quickly pull like starts or finishes or both, and I average them together, and you hit that like 50%. So 50% of the time we do what we say we're going to do. So you can always just extrapolate that out and start the conversation there without anything fancy, being like, this is not, like we have zero float on this job. If we're hitting 50% of the time, probably going to be late, folks. And I like how you're positioning that. I really liked how you position that with the project manager and how you're bringing that data to him and showing how that compression will pan out. How that does pan out, I think there are times where you can solve compression and there are times where you can't, and the job is just late. Can you walk us through a couple strategies of like when you get to that realization, and then how does that differ then from the like we need to pull this in, where you pull the data and it is clear where there's like no chance that we are anything faster than 3 months late? Because I do feel like that's a little bit of a different scenario oftentimes than we have a chance. And I think a lot of people hold, you brought it up earlier, the optimism bias. Too many people hold to like that we have a chance, and that plays into the, oh no, now we're late. But how do you get that addressed early in the conversation?
That's a really good question. And it actually goes back to my days prior to Smart PM. I was a claims consultant, really, or at least 50% of the time I was getting brought into disputes. And those disputes were typically delay related. We were pulled in towards the end of the job, right? When the problem had happened. Like all of a sudden we've admitted it's not going to happen. And now we've got all these reasons why that happened. Just somewhere around this time, we blew the end date out. All these changes I just dropped in there. Now, yeah, it rained so much and you gave me so many change orders, or your design was terrible. But the reality was, as a claims consultant, I'd go back to the beginning of the job. I'd listen to what they had to say. And then I'd go say, okay, great. I'm going to go look at the data and I'm going to come tell you what your data says. And I'm going to go back to the beginning of the job, because this didn't just happen last month. Your schedule didn't lose 6 months last month. There was a lot of things that led up to that, and there's a story behind it. So what I always wondered was, why are you not looking at your delays as they're happening and justifying what those delays are about? Usually that's the point where you're like backtracking, and then I come forward with an analysis that's completely different than what their recollection was, right? What does the data say versus what are you telling me now? And we, obviously there's truth to both, but what's been forgotten was the last 14 months prior to the last two. And there was a story of delays happening in that time. And many of those delays are likely, partially responsible of the contractor, partially responsible to the owner, but they were never discussed. And that's where I would say that doing, and we've built this into Smart PM is an ongoing delay analysis of your project, month over month, so that you can look at what were the delays and how did you respond and how did you perform around those delays. So our contractors that we work with now have visibility on what delayed your job in that period. While the delay was happening, what did you do to overcome those delays? Like, that's part of your contract, to do everything in your power to overcome the delays so you can show it to them. And then how did you respond in the future? And how at risk did the things get? And then what happened the next month? So usually there's a lot there that you can go back to the owner and say, hey, here's a delay that happened. I didn't cause it. It's what the data says. It's not what my, hired gun consultant said at the end of the job, but it's really what's happening in real time. And how would you like us to respond? Would you like us to compress the schedule and accelerate, because that'll cost money? Not to mention, you're engaging with the owner much sooner of patterns that they may have that are causing problems for the future that could be racking up if those problems keep existing. So being able to know what's delaying the job and how you're responding and having a forthright conversation through all of construction, as a matter of fact, builds a lot of trust and credibility to you as a manager, to you as a business. And it's all about what everybody wants here. Is nobody wants that nasty dispute. Everybody wants it on time. Delays are going to happen. They are going to cause problems. We can overcome some of them, but we need to be honest as well. And that back and forth, from what I've seen, especially when we have an owner leveraging Smart PM and a contractor, it creates much better collaboration amongst the job.
That's perfect. Well, Michael, we're coming close to time. You've mentioned Smart PM a couple times, but I would be sad if we didn't chat a little bit about it and tell the folks about it. So for those who, I was going to probably say something disparaging to my audience. For those who are unaware, what is Smart PM? How does it help out? And where can people find it?
Absolutely. So Smart PM was born out of my experience as a consultant doing a lot of manual analytics with schedule data. As you all know, probably,
You
that
got that
scheduling's
tired of
changed.
Excel. You're like that. I'm
Oh
so
yeah.
burned out.
Oh
VLOOKUPs
yeah.
and
As a person
macros.
who analyzes schedule data, you're constantly sitting there going, how could I make this easier? How could I
Yeah,
make it, less time consuming? And then you're just always thinking of ways to automate what you're trying to do manually in spreadsheets, and you feel as though you're sort of got your hands tied sometimes. And in having looked at so many projects, you see patterns like we talked about across every project I looked at. There's schedule best practice issues, like quality issues, that make it difficult to really understand with certainty what the critical and near critical paths were. Then there's updating risk, right? Missing information, getting too compressed, not understanding your delays. So Smart PM is a analytics system that really leverages your schedule data to your advantage in pretty much the entire construction life cycle, so that the schedule analytics are foundational to understanding overruns and delays. And that to me was a challenge, and the process is also misunderstood by many. So we wanted to put controls in place around the scheduling process, layer it in on top of your existing process, pull out as much quality data that we could about your execution, performance, and risk, and make it available to you at different, throughout all of construction, to solve all the little pain points along the way up until the end when you're dealing potentially with a delay claim. So it's a schedule analytics program on steroids that's available for the enterprise. It can be used at the project level, and it can be used at the operational level to get visibility into performance and risk and promote very good discussion and problem solving along the way. And we can be found at www.smartpm.com.
I'd also say, folks, Michael writes on LinkedIn and publishes some brilliant articles. So definitely go and check his work out because you can get some excellent tips and tricks for it. I read your article on schedule compression, which kind of got this conversation going, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. Mike, before we jump, any words, any thoughts you want to leave the crowd with?
Well, I hope everybody has a great 2025. I think it's going to be an interesting year
Yeah.
in the industry. I'm excited about it, but I hope everybody has a great year, and I really appreciate the time today, Micah.
Absolutely. Michael, thank you for coming on. Folks, appreciate you listening. If you could like, subscribe, or share, it helps us out tremendously building this audience. For us at Beyond Deadlines, though, we'll see you on the next one.